From the earliest accounts of man's religious life, sleep phenomena has been associated with oracles. We find evidences of this among practically all primitive peoples, and records, historical and otherwise, have descended from the more advanced culture groups. Sleep was regarded as a magic condition. It was in some ways a suspension of our outer life. The soul, it was assumed, could depart from the body, could visit into remote regions, and ascending through the various orbits of the world, come close to the divine principles at the root of life. Because dream phenomena were so obviously not of this world, it was assumed that there was another world in which dreams were real. And in the ancient Greek art, we have representations of the gate of sleep, leading from the mortal state into a strange temple where shadowy and phantom forms lurked in the gloom, or performed weird ritualistic dances around the altars of some ancient deity. It was not, however, in Greek culture alone that sleep gained the strange oracular authority which later came to be associated with it. Sleep was not only natural, but could be induced by artificial means. Very far back, men developed the hypnotic art, although they did not know them by such a name. They found ways by mesmeristic passes and mesmeric formulas to induce artificial sleep and to throw a subject into a state of somnambulism. At Delphi, the greatest of all the Grecian oracles, a kind of trance or ecstasy was induced by vapors rising from a deep vent in the earth. These vapors had an intoxicating effect, and when the priestess was seated on her tripod over this vent, she inhaled the fumes and passed into a strange, half-sleeping condition. And while in this state, gave forth the oracles, or the messages from the deities, in the form of hexameter verse. In the ancient grotto of Trophonius, another celebrated oracle of the time, those seeking answers to their questions were conducted down into a cave-like place. Here again there seems to have been either some natural fume which intoxicated the mind, or possibly those deciding to spend the night there were given drugs to induce visions. Drugs for this purpose are well known. Perhaps the most exciting example being the use of hashish by the sect of the Assassins in Iraq. Here a very powerful drug brought with it extraordinary ocular hallucinations, causing those who took it to believe that they had been transported into the paradise promised by Muhammad in the Quran. Drugs were used by the Druids, and various incenses are frequently referred to. And in one early work we know that some of the heretical Christian sects of the first few centuries were accused of drugging the communion cup in order to produce ecstasies and trances, during which religious experiences were recorded. In addition to this phase, the sleep phenomena could be affected by fasting and by the general weakening of the body, also by the use of certain foods or exercises or discipline, producing a curious kind of fatigue. The American Indian induced a form of hypnotic trance by moving an eagle feather back and forth before the eyes of the subject. These trances could also be induced by music, by dance, by various ecstatic forms of ritualism, some of which have descended to us in the excitement and ecstasy of the holy rollers and other peculiar groups of Adventists. Thus we see that from an early time men sought to induce artificial sleep, or in one way or another to destroy the normal equilibrium of man's objective awareness, casting him into some kind of glamour, either through drugging or through fatiguing the senses. Because in these states he was held to have a peculiar proximity to spiritual mysteries. The motive was quite sincere. It was the only way, however, that these people believed that it was possible to open this door between the worlds and to find some means of retiring into the mystery of the divine root of things, or that other world which was closed to us by the ordinary orientation of our sensory perception. There is a very interesting Japanese fable of two young people in love who attempted to what they called in those days elope into the other world. It's a very curious thought, and of course it ended in suicide. But these lovers were trying to break through again this barrier which divided a condition of being from another condition of being. It was early assumed that the dream world was closely identified with the world of the dead. A man asleep appeared to be dead, but was not really so. Death was a long sleep. Sleep was a little death. St. Paul points this out, and he says, I die daily. This mystery of sleep and the breaking through seems to have affected our psychology and our general attitude toward life, and have descended subtly to us in a number of our beliefs and superstitions and legends. Now, what does this tell us that may be of immediate importance? The oracular procedures of the Greeks could not have succeeded had the oracles of the Pythian Apollo at Delphi not been, for the most part, true. It is, of course, certain, and this is the out for the modern skeptic, that these oracles were often ambiguous. difficult of interpretation, obscure until the event actually transpires. But Cicero, gathering a record of these reports, came to the conclusion that the majority of them were wise beyond the wisdom of the world, that there was something about them that transcended the judgment of conscious man. And in many instances, of course, they were amazingly fulfilled to the smallest detail. The reason why the Greek oracles were famous and were consulted by persons in every class of life undoubtedly was the reputation which gradually built around them. This reputation for accuracy has also been mentioned by older writers, and the most grudging have admitted that these oracles were universally constructive, that their recommendations were for the private and public good, that they did contribute a great deal to peace of mind and to the guidance of states and to the direction of leaders. And many of their less fortunate revelations also proved to be true. And warnings which they gave were seldom ignored without disaster. Even Socrates seems to have admired the oracles and to have acknowledged that they represented perhaps one of the deepest sources of man's possible knowledge of life and the world. Many of the oracles were also broadly informative. They brought answers to questions in art, science, religion, philosophy. They assisted in the preservation of crops. They aided the agriculturist in his plans for the harvest. They warned of storms and of pestilences. And it was rather obvious to these people that such information was not normally to be attained in a waking state. Now, the priestesses of Delphi, while selected with the greatest care, were mostly young women, although some reached elder years with great dignity and distinction. These young women were not trained in the worldly pursuits which might have been possible to them in these days. They were virgins of the temple. They lived apart and alone, a cloistered existence. They were not instructed in statecraft or in medicine or in any of these subjects, but were assured that the truthfulness of their revelation depended upon the purity and integrity of their own lives. This, I think, is a further point of interest, and one which will bear consideration. Obviously, the normal state of man can be both naturally and artificially deranged. And among most older people, the insane, the mad, those hopelessly infirm of mind, were regarded with a peculiar veneration. They were believed to be very close to God. They were God's own. They did not belong, really, in this world. And it was the responsibility of all to treat them with kindness and to protect them, sometimes even from themselves. But this madness was something like the divine madness, the madness of the Dionysiac cult, induced by the juice of the vine, the intoxication which was held in religious rituals to open these mysterious interior perceptions, so that, of course, the use of wine in the sacrament, even to this time, originated in this Dionysiac rite, the rite of frenzy, the rite by means of which the individual seemed to suddenly escape from his human limitation and to be able to commune with powers beyond this world and even bring back messages of general interest. Many of the early American Indian tribes also made use of this broad concept. In their case, usually trances were brought on either by hypnotic means or by a form of autosuggestion. These old medicine priests seem to have been able to cast themselves into trances more or less at will. And here, in tribal life, they had an unusual opportunity to demonstrate the accuracy of their foreknowledge. They were depended upon in a time when no dependable sciences existed, when laws and codes did very little to protect either the individual or the group. The person who had no rights, no privileges of legal or medical help, who was without any advantages of modern psychology or classical philosophy, built his life very largely upon phenomena. And this phenomena was nearly always associated with sleep mystery and the power of the soul to depart in sleep to explore those things which it most needed to know. Now we can divide our thinking on this subject into two very broad patterns. The first, and one that is still held by many mystics, is that essentially the old concept was correct. That sleep does mysteriously liberate the soul from the body, or if not a total liberation, at least gives the soul a more positive existence while the body is at rest. East Indian metaphysics intimates this same concept, that the soul can temporarily leave the body and can have adventures and experiences which may later be brought through into remembrance, or partly so, although some elements may evade us or elude us as we return to the waking state. The other broad school affirms that the phenomena of the dream can be rationally explained on a psychological level. That it is not actually that the soul leaves the body, but that the psychic nature comes into a new relationship to the personality during sleep. That in sleep condition, the objective person is in a state of almost complete suspension of animation. In sleep, the outer world loses its power to impress and influence. In sleep, we appear to be temporarily free from the burden of even our own opinions. In sleep, a quietude descends upon the mind and the emotions, and they are at rest. This quietude makes possible a man's sensing of deeper phases of his own life. This quietude permits certain currents to seemingly reverse themselves, so that instead of man receiving his principal stimulation from the outside, he suddenly becomes passive and experiences life moving from within himself. That an inner world imposes itself upon the outer, whereas in the waking state, this imposition from within is made comparatively impossible by the activity of the objective faculties. This is, of course, an essential concept of mysticism, and sleep becomes a kind of stillness, a natural form of mystical experience. In this stillness, the individual becomes acutely receptive. Now, what does he receive into this receptivity? Theoretically, at least, he can receive impressions from around him which might not normally be recorded. Even in sleep, man has certain kinds of awareness, but these are more subtle, dealing with the more sensitive value than those of the waking state. Parapsychology researchers suggest the possibility that in the sleep state, man may attain a certain clairvoyance, a certain at least clairsentience, a telepathic rapport with other persons. In sleep, he may sense more acutely the thoughts of his neighbors, friends, and associates. He may be more responsive intuitively to the temperament of those around him. In sleep also, he may receive into himself masses of telepathic fragments from the lives and thoughts and emotions of countless persons. These may or may not have any general meaning, but under some conditions they may also assume prophetic proportions. In this same general area, it becomes quite conceivable that man can attune himself to some kind of record or recording that remains in space around him at all times. We are not sure that space is non-intellectual. We are not sure that the air around us is not a mental atmosphere. We cannot be certain that nature itself does not have its own thinking, and that in a receptive mood we may tune in to these larger thoughts which perhaps we can later interpret in genius and great artistry. There seems to be a tendency also for this receptivity to be conditioned by certain major phases of our interest. We know that if we take certain thoughts to sleep, we may have dream experiences relating to these thoughts. We also recognize the age-old custom of taking problems to sleep, with the concept that in the morning we will awaken with the answer. And many have had this experience. We also know that great artists, great musicians, and scientists have generally admitted the importance of sleep phenomena in the advancement of their various abilities. Musicians have heard their melodies in sleep, or dreams, or trance-like states. Artists have seen the pictures which they would later place upon canvas. Sleep also approximates another state of man, who cultivates a kind of sleep in the disciplines of meditation and the various retrospective and contemplative exercises of the Greek theory and of the East Indian school. These meditations are quietude, leading finally perhaps to an almost complete submersion of the personal consciousness in a deep and mysterious ocean of universal value, such as is intimated in the Samadhi of Vedanta, or the mysterious nirvanic trances of the Buddhist arhats. Thus, contemplative discipline bring about again this tendency to detach the mind from the commonplace, from the everyday, and to submerge it more deeply in a tranquility, thus apparently opening the way for a sensitive apperception of things, of energies, of forces, of influences not otherwise immediately noticed. Out of this thinking, whether it be held to be mystical or psychological, we have come to certain practical conclusions which affect the practice of modern psychology and psychiatry to a marked degree. One of the conclusions is that in many instances, sleep phenomena are a valuable aid to the interpretation of the psychic complex of the human personality. That under certain conditions, dreams are not only keys to characteristics, but do constitute a form of admonition, a warning, or an inclination, a kind of instruction by which nature would seek to assist us in immediate understanding of some peculiarity of our own emotion or thought. We know that everywhere nature eternally strives to repair the damage that is caused by human ignorance. If this damage is too great, nature is not equal to the task. But wherever possible, nature sets into action auto-corrective mechanisms to assist us in restoring this equilibrium upon which normalcy and health depend. Thus, as surely as we secure or receive hunches, feelings, we are also inclined to have this awareness of a need for a particular change in conduct or a modification of habits. Many interesting experiences relating to this type of nature's helpfulness have been recorded. An individual, even without sleep, will suddenly become acutely aware of some deficiency in his own nature. He will have a flash of insight which forms a corrective pattern to deliver him from some emergency in which he is in danger of becoming involved. There are many instances of foreknowledge in this department, which have caused a person to cancel a trip on a train which was afterwards wrecked, or to not take a certain plane trip when the plane came to disaster. This kind of forewarning or premonition we know because it is testified to by generations of sincere and thoughtful persons. Most of these warnings, however, pass unheeded. We rationalize ourselves out of them. There are numbers of cases also where we record persons who have come to grief as a result of ignoring some kind of intuitional flash which might have saved them. In our daily way of existence, we do not take for granted that this internal insight is legitimate. We do not feel impelled to follow it. If it does not fit into our preconceptions, we ignore it. If it is inconvenient to follow its instructions, we violate them and have certain argumentative procedures by which we justify our own attitude. This is particularly true in a case of conscience, in which we do have certain very strong pressures, which sometimes are accepted and recognized, but often violated. We have no great and full explanation of the conscience process, but we are inclined to feel that what we call conscience today has to do with the individual violating some preconception upon which he has learned to lean, or the validity of which he has accepted. Therefore, conscience does not represent any spiritualized faculty, but merely the voice of his traditional acceptances. Psychology, however, does recognize the fact that the violation of conscience mechanism will nearly always prove detrimental. They destroy a degree of integration within the person. They cause him to have less faith in himself. They cause him to feel less respect for his own nature. If he feels that he is transgressing some value which he holds to be real, he is disappointed in himself. And he also develops the fear mechanism, because conscience usually involves some machinery of punishment. The individual who goes against his conscience is opening himself to some kind of retribution, which is not pleasant or to be desired. Now, conscience operates when we are awake, but we have every reason to suspect that it operates even more actively when we are asleep. For nearly all impulse and instinct are more powerful when the conscious mind does not modify their pressure. The conscious mind of man causes a focalizing of objective awareness. The individual becomes acutely centered in his objective nature. In this centering, he is exceptionally responsive to the visible and physical things around him, and very little does he respond to the invisible, superphysical things within him. Thus he lives objectively, and with very little recourse to the principles which lie locked within him. This brings us then to the elements or the chemistry of the psychic factor as it might be involved in dream phenomena. Question may be asked in the first place, does man know more when he is asleep than when he is awake? I would say that probably not, but that he is more aware of what he knows. In the waking state, the individual does not have immediate access to the various levels of his own subconscious. In other words, he cannot be consciously aware of the subconscious. About the only part of his internal defense mechanism that is available to him is memory. Memory can issue warnings and does. Memory can remind him of the hazards of an enterprise and will do so. But the individual frequently resists memory on the ground that each new situation is a unique thing, and therefore it cannot be explained merely by reference to previous experiences. Thus the burglar who has been jailed twice may remember this, but it will not prevent him from making a third attempt to burglarize something on the ground that he now has perfected the perfect crime. Later he will remember that this did not work either, but by that time he will be planning upon a new course of procedure which he believes will violate his expectancies of being caught. Thus, memory does not serve us in everything, but memory makes available a small part of our own previous experience. A very great part of that general experience, however, is not rememberable by any conscious process, and therefore only certain phases of our own disposition can be reached by the memory technique. There are other parts which do not respond to this type of stimulation, for it must be the result of association mechanisms to bring memory into operation. On the level of the unremembered, there may also be a great deal of that which is truly known, but that we know not that we know. This, in turn, causes a series of experiences which occasionally come into our objective understanding. Here again we have inspirational moments. Here we have sudden mystical stretches or spells or instants of insight. Something totally beyond the ordinary. Something that memory alone will not explain by normal procedure is suddenly known to us. So in this knowing to us, I believe there is another element that we have to bear in mind. It may have an effect upon the entire problem of learning from dreaming. Man's inner life is undoubtedly archetypal. And by that I now mean that it represents a pattern. Man's internal organization is built upon law. It is a formula, lawful in itself, and depending for its continuance upon obedience to basic laws of existence. Thus, inside himself, man is a law-abiding creature, even though in his outer personality he may be a lawbreaker. Man mentally, even emotionally, seeks to outwit his own lawfulness. He finds innumerable excuses, and in the course of ages, the external tradition of man has deviated markedly from the internal record or report. The reason for this has been that objectivity, by the intensity of its processes,